Alrighty, good morning, everyone. Hello, welcome and welcome back to the third day of activities as part of Code Summer Institute, Embodied Stories, Gender, the Body, and Oral History. Today, we're pleased to welcome you to two workshops. The first, Mapping Collectively, run by Sébastien Caquard and the students from the Geomedia Lab at Concordia University, will be introduced shortly. Once again, for those of you unfamiliar with Fourth Space, welcome to our virtual channel. Fourth Space itself is located in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Indigenous land, and it's a university-wide platform that connects the public with the inner workings of Concordia University by activating the various research projects, teaching, and cross-disciplinary initiatives brewing across the uni. We invite you to follow us on social media or subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep up with daily events, and I'll put those links in the chat in a minute. We are once again meeting style today, so you know the rules. Please engage in this space via text or by raising your hand and speaking. Participation is welcomed. And once again, I'll remind you that we are recording and streaming to Facebook, but the view is set to active speaker for the recording, so you won't be visible unless you speak. On that note, it's my pleasure to pass it over to Luis Sotelo Castro, who will introduce this workshop. Over to you, Luis.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, everyone. My name is Luis Carlos Sotelo. I'm the second co-director of the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling, and also the director of the Acts of Listening Lab, a research hub to explore, on research creation to explore the transformative power of listening in the context of oral history performance. And it's my pleasure to introduce this workshop, Mapping Collectively Gender Issues with Atlascine, which is going to be led by the Geomedia Lab under the direction of Professor Sébastien Caquard, the first or the other second director of the Center for Oral History. So let me introduce the team to you. We have Jose Alaves, is a PhD candidate at Concordia University's Department of Geography. His PhD research focuses on studying the stories of individuals who experience death in the context of migration. Good morning, Jose. Well, I guess.
Good morning, Luis.
Oh, yeah, perfect. Good morning. Then we also have Sepide Shahamati, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at Concordia. Her research focuses on identifying and documenting intangible heritage of cities. Good morning, Sepide.
Good morning.
Okay. We also have Leah Daniel, who is a PhD candidate at Concordia University's Department of Geography. Her research investigates the potential of cartography as a mediating tool between indigenous people and settlers. Good morning, Leah.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. Okay, and we also have Emery Shaw. He has an MSc in Geography from Concordia and a BA from McGill University. Emery is interested in people's geographic imaginaries. He's also a core contributor to the Atlascine project. Emery, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Well, Sebastian Kakad is a geographer and a map maker interested in mapping stories. He is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at Concordia, the director of the Geomedia Lab, and the co-director of CODES, Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling. Good morning, Sebastian. Good luck, and over to you.
Ok, merci beaucoup, Luis, pour cette présentation. Merci, Cynthia, pour l'organisation de cet événement. Good morning, everyone. And also thank you to Fourspace for hosting this event. So today we're gonna do a workshop type of activity. This is what's on the title. So you'll be invited to contribute because we're gonna show you a tool that we have developed, and we're gonna introduce the tool first. But then after that, we'll ask you to work on basically two things. What is a place? How do we define a place in a story? And that will be the first part of our activity. And then how do we define themes associated with this place? And in the context of the workshop, it will be about gender issues. So we will work together to address those two questions, and Leah will present that in more details in a few minutes. So first, I'm going to introduce the application that we'll be using, that has been really designed to map stories. And there are not that many applications like that. There's many great applications, like mapping application to tell stories with map. So basically to take clips, to take audio, to take text, pictures, to point them on a map, and then to have a multimedia interaction with them. What we've done is different. We really wanted to keep the entire story with the map. And this is really the base of this application, is just to make sure that we do not break the story into bits and pieces, but we keep it the integrity of the story. And then what the application enables is a back and forth between the map and the story. And we want also to keep the map because the map has a real power in terms of visualization and in terms of making visible things that may not be visible when you listen to the story. But at the same time, by doing that, it hides a lot of things that are somewhere in the nuances of the story and in the choices that the map makers have made. And so what we really wanted to do this application in cartographic terms is really to break the mediated part of the map by keeping both the full story and the map at the same time. And so this is where we've developed this application. One of the reasons behind that was we've been working with stories from the Center for Oral History for quite a few years, almost a decade now. And we always feel uncomfortable in turning these stories into categories that can be mappable, because we have no credit or no, our positioning is not well, it's not well aligned with this decision that we need to make. So that was really the idea of trying to make sure that we keep the transparency and we keep both of those elements. So just to start, I'm gonna share my screen to show you a bit of the project. So the project is Atlascine, and you started by the idea of what we can learn about places by mapping stories. So stories tell us about how people experience places, and if you want to really learn about places, we need to take into consideration those stories. So this is where we were started to be interested in mapping those stories. We used a series of stories collected by the Center for Oral History in the context of the Histoire de Vie de Montréal. Those stories were collected from 2007 to 2012. And in the atlas that we're going to show you, we have mapped 21 stories from the Rwandan community. So the members of the communities have been collecting stories from other members of the communities through this process, and we have mapped 21 of those stories that we've been working with the Page Rwanda, the organization that has been helping collecting those stories. So the mapping of these stories is really the linking between the mapping interest we have and the oral history project. But the question becomes quickly how to define a place in the story, and this is what we'll be talking about. And we've been working on that, and we'll be exposing you to the complexity of this task. So here's Atlascine that has been designed by that. So those are some images taken by David Ward of the Community of the Years. And then if you go to the map part of the atlas, you enter here, and then you have access to 3 different things. So a map on the left, a video on the right, and the transcript of this video. So transcript could be in different languages, depending if you have the transcript in 2 or more languages. And then you have more stories here. So we have our 21 story, and then I'm gonna start the video here, and then I'll explain how this works.
beaucoup d'avoir accepté de nous partager votre histoire de vie et du coup de participer au projet Histoire de vie de Montréal. Alors on va commencer sans plus tarder. Et je voulais d'abord qu'on parle de votre enfance et les souvenirs que vous gardez de vos grands-parents, que vous les avez connus.
Je n'ai connu que le grand-père maternel. Très très bon souvenir parce qu'on y allait en vacances. Et c'était un monsieur très gentil et qui nous aimait évidemment beaucoup.
So just to start here, Emmanuel is introducing herself, and then you notice that the text is going through when the video is going on. So the video is in French, right? So it was recorded in French, but the transcripts are both in French and English. And when the video went up here, where it's blue, then there's this point that appears on the map. If I go above, the point is not here. If I go here, the point's up here. And so the point here is related to this part. And so the map is linked to this connection here. And so the connection appears here with those tags. So we have two types of tags. The theme tags, here she's talking about her family and childhood, but we could add father, we could add whatever we want. And then there's a place tag, which is Rwanda. So the theme tag will define the color of the circle, and the place tag will define the location of the point on the map. So the location and the color is defined by the legend here. So we have a legend where we can add any tag we want, and if we add them here and in the text, they get the color that is here. And then we have so those are the tags that we have created, but any tag could be added at any moment. So there's forced displacement, there's violence, there's family, childhood, work, resistance, etc. And I can add some more tags if I want. For instance, if I decide that here she's talking about the Montreal Life Story Project, so I could add a tag education because it's a university project, for instance, and Montreal. The time the data is sent, and then here the point in Montreal appears, right? So I can have those points appear here, back and forth. What I'm gonna do this. So what happens is that when you go through the story, there are more tags appearing with different colors. And so I can click here and I can see there's an accumulation of those tags here. So I can zoom here, for instance, and I can see that there are different places of interest related to exile. So I can navigate here and listen how she talks about that place.
Donc, c'était comme waouh.
Vous arrivez à combiner facilement travail et études
pendant les vacances.
C'était vraiment pendant les vacances.
Non, je ne combinais pas.
Okay. Et là, quand les études reprenaient.
And so we can, this the timeline here, it's the same timeline. So we can go back and forth and see how different places is associated with different type of tags. And so there are different information that you can see on the map. One is where this story is related to, what are the places important in this story. The bigger is the number of places, the more important. Here it's a bit of an awkward place because it's Rwanda, so it's aggregate everything about Rwanda, but all these other places are more like more local places. And then I can look at what's the color associated to the places. For instance, here there's a lot of green about ethnicity here, which is at the border between the Congo and the Rwanda, but also some red about violence and darker gray about genocide, and then post-genocide. So I can see how the theme evolved at this place throughout the story, because when I'm at the center of the circle here, I'm at the beginning of the story. When I'm at the edge here, I'm at the end of the story. And so here it's more about post-genocide. Nyamata, that's where she went for instance, after her parents died here. Here there's more Kabuga associated with violence, etc. I can, of course, select the theme that I'm interested in, etc. So this gives us a way to navigate back and forth between any type of topic that we're interested in and the story, and going back and forth with the story. Then I can also look at different stories to see the geography of different stories. So here's the story for Anita Mwimbu 2. Bert Gaillet is more around Goma. Emmanuel Abimana is more around Bukavu, etc. So we can map all the geographies of those different stories. What we can do also is to compare those different stories. So here we have a module named Multimap. And what happens, it seems pretty trivial, but it's actually pretty powerful, is that it switches. So here, instead of having the name of the stories, you have the legend. You have the different topics that you have identified in the legend, and you can add and remove topics as much as you want. And here you have the different stories that appear here that you can select and map. So if we want to see about exile, for instance, I can select the stories, and you can see that, whoa, there's a lot of data about that. So I can zoom into Rwanda, and then start to see different types of stories. I can look at stories around Kigali if I want, and listen stories about the L'Hôtel des Mille Collines, because it's here, and so we can hear that there are different people who've been going to the same place at moments of their life, but sometimes overlapping at the same place. So this is one, and I'm sorry, we'll spend more time listening to those stories. At the moment, I'm just showing how it works, but there were like two of those. Although
J'étais blessée.
these two, so you can listen to moments in the story.
Puis il y a Ébélitaire
So this gives you a sense of how the application works. And now I'm gonna turn it to Leah, I think, for a contextualization of a particular story, because what we're gonna be doing now is just, we're gonna focus on one segment of a story, and we're gonna work together to map it here for during this workshop.
Great, Sebastian. So I'm just going to introduce a bit quickly the life of Emmanuel Keikoa, just to give you some context, right, before we move into the story segment that we have selected. So Emmanuel Keikoa's story is the story of a Rwandan Tutsi woman who had a happy childhood before being forced to leave with her parents when she was 11 due to educational discrimination against the Tutsis. And then a few years later, in 1973, she's forced to leave her country to escape a wave of extreme ethnic violence against the Tutsis and seek refuge in Burundi. Overall, this is the story of a young woman who spent more than 20 years of her adult life moving between Rwanda, Burundi, and Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, fleeing violence and the genocide of the Rwandan Tutsis, to arrive in Montreal at the end of 1994. In this particular segment, Emmanuel describes how she finds her sister in Kabuga in Rwanda right after the genocide. So the goal of this workshop then is we're going to listen to this story segment together, and there's going to be a link in the chat where you can see the text. And we ask you to listen to this story segment with us and try to figure out in the text what places seem relevant to map. So what places stand out for you, and what themes seem relevant to identify and map associated to these places, right? So that's what we're going to do right now. And I'll pass the floor to Sebastian and Emery to take us through that.
Yes, thanks, Leah. I think Sebastian and Leah did a really good presentation of Atlascine. There's not much more for me to add. So I'm gonna share my screen. Sound. And so the story segment we'll be looking at together is right here. And so we'll be listening to it together. You probably noted since the beginning of the talk, each story or some stories have translations. So this one is in French originally. We have a translated transcript as well. So I'm going to be playing the video in French, and I'll have the English transcript rolling alongside it. You could open up the platform on your own browser if you wish and look at it yourself in whatever language you want. I will also be sharing in the chat hold on.
You want me to do it, Emery?
Yes, please. Yes, please. If you have the chat open. Yes, I'm
So
unable to chat.
I did it.
Okay, so this is the segment of the story that Emery will be playing. For the I can put also the link to the application, or maybe we can do that after. The only thing is that you need to have a very good internet connection, because you have to load videos and map and a lot of data. So if your internet connection is so, you may feel that it's not as smooth as it could be. But you could do that, and you need to use either Firefox or Chrome. But I can share the link as well, like that people can have access to it.
Okay, well, okay, I see, sorry, I see the chat now, it just appeared. Okay, so good, so that's the link that you need to use, and it just basically provides you the transcript, and you can take notes with that and read alongside, and pull out a pen and paper or another document, write your thoughts about the story segment as we go along with it. So I will be playing it now. We'll turn on my sound to full, and if there are any sound quality issues, please let me know. Here we go. So let's all listen together. Here we go.
Ça ne m'appartient plus. Donc, on a continué après ça. On est arrivé vers... Parce que là, il faut voir qu'on traversait les points tchèques, comme ils disent, les points tchèques à l'autre. Il y avait quand même des officiers, il y avait des militaires de FPR. Et puis on disait les gens qui étaient au centre, qui ont survécu, où est-ce qu'ils sont. C'était bien organisé. Ils disaient les gens de Kigali Centre, ils sont tous à Kabuga. Les gens de tel endroit, ils sont à tel endroit. Ce qui fait qu'on est allé à Kabuga. Et puis on disait, ma petite sœur s'appelle Caritas, il a été évacué ici. Puis est-ce que vous la connaîtriez? Il dit c'est la femme de qui? Tu sais là-bas, c'est la fille de qui? C'est la femme de qui? Au fil en aiguille, et puis on explique, voilà, c'est elle, c'est elle, c'est elle. Ah oui, allez le voir à tel endroit, il n'y a pas de numéro, et puis finalement je suis arrivée à la trouver. Elle était là, oui, avec son mari était en Ouganda parce qu'il avait eu des balles quand même dans les genoux. Il était allé se faire opérer, il était évacué sur l'Ouganda, il était avec sa belle-sœur, il était avec d'autres personnes dans la maison. Il y avait comme une vingtaine de personnes qui se partageaient justement l'espace là où il les avait mis. Et ma sœur, comme c'est une battante, c'est elle qui faisait à manger pour tout le monde, et qui organisait tout le monde, et qui était enceinte de 5 mois. Mais c'est elle qui organisait vraiment tout le monde. Trouver cette énergie, moi je me dis, mais moi, je suis qui pour me couler par terre? Donc, c'est justement dans la survie de ce moment-là de dire j'ai survécu, que j'ai trouvé qu'elles étaient vraiment braves d'aller s'en dire la vie continue, donc il faut qu'on mange, il faut qu'on... On a survécu, c'est déjà un grand cadeau, c'était déjà comme un miracle, alors on n'a pas le droit de se replier. Et puis, c'était pas le moment de vivre aussi les traumas, parce que pour elles, c'était pas compréhensible. Au contraire, c'était qu'il y avait beaucoup plus d'empathie envers moi, parce qu'ils disaient, tu vis les Yamata, c'est vrai, ma mère est décédée, c'est vrai. Donc, tu l'as pas vu. Donc, c'était comme, pauvre toi, tu as vraiment confronté ça, tu as vécu ça. Donc, c'était comme, elle, c'est pas grave. Elle, ça va très bien. C'est moi que ça va pas.
Alors que c'est la petite sœur.
Oui. Et puis, elle voulait me protéger. Jusqu'aujourd'hui, elle me dit, c'est vous qui n'étiez pas là, qui avez plus de souffrance que nous. Parce que nous, on a cette chance, on a ce bonheur d'avoir survécu. Donc, au contraire, il y a des choses que vous avez vécues que nous n'avons pas vécues. Nous, c'était la peur, justement, de se dire, peut-être c'est ce soir, peut-être c'est demain, mais vous vous imaginiez, vous aviez autant de peine que nous de savoir que nous allons mourir et que vous ne pouvez pas nous sauver. Et jusqu'à présent, c'est vous qui avez tout vu, comme je te disais tout à l'heure. Nous, il y a des choses que nous n'avons jamais vues, que nous ne verrons jamais. C'est nous la joie de dire que la vie continue, on est là et puis...
C'est beau, je trouve, comment elle a dit ça. Hein,
oui.
All right.
Maybe before we start, Leah, if you could recontextualize a bit the story, not that the segment that now that we listen to it, may be useful just for everyone to understand what she's talking about.
Right. So we've listened to this story segment together, and we would like you to do two things. The first thing would be to highlight some important places that she mentioned. Now, they don't have to be necessarily actual names of places, although that's obviously one avenue, but also some places like a house or something like that, any place that you find significant. In the second phase, we'd like you to identify some relevant themes to these places.
And just to contextualize this segment of the story, this is right at the end of the genocide. She's looking for her sister, and then she went to a camp because she found her sister in a camp. Well, she was outside the country during the genocide, and she just came in to find a member of her family, and she just coming back from actually finding that her parents died. So the segment before is really describing when she went back to the village where her parents were, and she found that they were dead, and she was not able even to find the remains of her mother. So this is kind of where the segment lies here.
And so yeah, so we will be mapping this together. I'll be tagging things as we discuss. And notice that the map that we have on the left is empty. So this is an empty map that we'll be mapping together, to be clear.
So maybe we can take a few minutes here for you to go back to the segment, either through the online, the Google Doc that we share. There's both the French and the English version, that Google Doc. And then maybe in about 5 minutes, we can start discussing maybe the topics of interest, the thing that you think are important, again, in the context of gender issues and embodiment. That is the theme of the symposium, of the conference. So let's take a few minutes, and then maybe then we can start a conversation around those topics. Meanwhile, feel free to jump in, to make comments, to ask questions, to engage in a conversation.
I have a question, which is what is Nyamata? The sister says you come from Nyamata.
Town.
Pardon?
Nyamata is the village where her parents were.
Okay.
And that's where it's so loaded, because she just went to discover where her parents were not anymore because they died. And her sister tells her, you've been through that, like you've been through the process of discovering that our parents, so you also suffered because you didn't. That's kind of the tension in this segment between the two sisters, one who didn't really fully embodiedly experience the genocide because she was not in Rwanda doing the genocide, and her sister was saying, yeah, don't, like, you experienced the death of the parents, well, I didn't. So it's kind of trying to reconfort each other somehow.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful.
So maybe we can start to see what you've been able to identify. So I see in the chat that the sister was in Kabuga. Yeah, so we have a place, and maybe a topic. Sister could be a theme, but I don't know if this is something that you're interested in. So Cynthia has a series of places: Nyamata, checkpoints, Central Kigali, Kabuga, house in Uganda, and then different themes: displacement, evacuation, searching for relatives, pregnancy, survival, trauma, loss, witnessing versus escaping. Okay, yeah, we have all those. Maybe you can start with one to see if it's possible to map that, because then the issue that is, and the challenge, and this is really where we want to come to have that discussion. It's just like, how do you associate a place with one of those topics? And sometimes you don't necessarily need to associate a place. I mean, it's not a requirement for us. We can have it on the map, but we can also tag only themes if you prefer. And if there's no real places associated with those particular themes. So I don't know, Cynthia, do you want to start?
Well, the thing that strikes me is that even though things are named, and there are some place names, so that presumably one could geolocate those, but there are also many things that are not specifically indicated in such a way that you could figure out exactly where they were, like the checkpoints. You know, I felt that was very evocative from her story, that there was this passage through these checkpoints, which I felt this confusion and not knowing when it would end, and you know, how she would end up after going through them. So there's something very amorphous about some of the places that she mentions, but they were also key to her journey. So I don't know how you would map the checkpoints, but that also seems like it's something that many survivors of the genocide would have gone through those checkpoints too. And then much more importantly, perhaps, is the house in Uganda. So Uganda is a whole country, so where is the house? You know, but that house where those 20 people were, and finding her sister there, I mean, I can't imagine the relief to have found her sister, you know, with her pregnancy still intact and miraculously looking after everybody, including her wounded husband. You know, that house seems so important to know where it is, but how do you know where it is? So I see the challenge that you're trying to present to us. I would be curious to know how the team resolves things like that. Like, how do you do extra research to try and find out where or cross-reference between interviews to try and find out where something like that house might have been?
This is a super interesting point, and this is definitely a challenge we're facing all the time. And this is also one of the reasons why we want the text to stay with the map, because at any point where you're gonna do, if you decide to make those interpretation, then you're gonna start to be away from the story, because you're gonna make interpretation or you're gonna be on something else. So we really want to make sure that the text and the map, not only the map just show the story, but also demonstrate that it's not as accurate that it looks like. Because if you go, you can always challenge every point you see on the map, because you can always interpret them differently. And also because you miss all these checkpoints, because you're right. And furthermore, when people are in confusion, they have a hard time to remember exact place name, or they don't necessarily want to tell them because they're like for personal reason, they don't feel comfortable telling those names. They don't remember them, and so they won't get those spatial images. And I think the checkpoints is very important, because those there are other stories where every time they cross a checkpoint they can die. So every time they it's another spatial dimension. And of course they have no idea where it is, because they're kind of hidden into a car or a truck or whatever. So they know it's a checkpoint because they can hear a conversation, but they don't know exactly where it is. So, and this is definitely one of the limits. But maybe just as a sideway, and just to illustrate what's possible, I'm gonna show something else here, like a different type of work. Maybe you can stop sharing your screen, Emory, and then I'm gonna share something else, which is a series of maps designed by a postdoctoral fellow, Elise Olmedo, of that very same story. So what she does is that she does sensibility mapping. And we know the limit of the conventional mapping approach. So we also understand that we need to have different approach if we want to really map those stories. And so our approach is just to listen and to go into more depth into particular moment of the story. And that's what she does here. So I don't know if in this particular map, she's mapping the checkpoints, but here it's the same, it's the segment of the story. So those are the checkpoints here that are mapped, because where are the people from Kigali, my little sister? So it's this exact segment that is being represented here in a different way. So she went first to, so it contextualized the moment. She went first to see her parents. She found the grave for her dad, but she found the remains of people in the church, and maybe her mother was there, but she has no idea. And then those are the checkpoints. And then she goes to, that's the conversation where she finally her sister, and then she goes on to Nyamirambo. So it's another visual interpretation. And there's a full legend here that explain so the map goes with the legend. Sorry, I don't have both of them on the same screen, but the map goes with the legend that explain how she interpreted the text and the representation of the text.
So Sebastian, a couple people have given suggestions in the chat. So maybe we could revert back to Atlascine and show what it can do.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm seeing great points in the chat too. So I'm going to start tagging in accordance with what I'm looking at.
So which one are we starting with? Diana comments? I don't know, Diana, if you want to jump in and engage, or we can just take your suggestions. So yeah.
One of the points that I had made was that it seems that there was a center for survivors in Kabuga, where her sister, where she found her sister.
Yeah. Okay, so Emory is now tagging that. So survivors, family, and so now we're starting from scratch, right? So we need to define how we want those topics to appear on the map. Surviving could be the theme for the legend, and so we can have different topics. And of course, you can play with the colors. So here we are now. We have the that part associated with survivor that appears on the map. And you can go as fine as you want in terms of granularity, right? If you want to map center from survivor, then you can add that. You choose the tag. If you want to have a full sentence as a tag, you can. So it's really designed for people to think about what kind of topic they're interested in mapping and how they're interested in mapping it. So Kabunka, so we see that it's in a suburb of Kigali. The husband was sent to Uganda because he was injured. And yes, I mean, at this stage, and I think that Cynthia pointed it clearly, we have no idea where it is. But often we do by listening to the entire story, because at some points she will say, oh, my husband is from this village in Uganda. And so also we may not know if when he went back, he was to this village, but often we have clues throughout the story that enable us to have a better sense of where the things are located than what the name explain. And it's pretty common, the use of the national name to talk about a particular place. People will tend to say, he went back to Uganda to see his family. And of course, there may be in different places, but we know that the parents, for instance, that it's for sure when they're living in this particular place. And so we can point that more precisely than what the story says in terms of words.
Sebastian, there are some questions about the drawings, if they're available. They're asking if they're available with a map, and there's another comment that they're more interested in the drawings. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Thank you, Sepide. Yeah, so the drawing, again, I'm gonna put her name here. She's not here because she just had a baby. So there she is. So she's a postdoctoral fellow here at Concordia, and the drawing are like, the idea is to have them with the map. We don't have that yet, but the idea is to find a way to bring those into the story, just like we bring the other maps. So having maybe a pop-up window with the segment that have been mapped that highlight that for this particular place, you have this particular way of thinking about the spatial structure of the narrative, or maybe the experience, because she's really interested in the emotional and the experiential, the embodiment of those moments. At the moment, they're not like fully available. We just submitted a paper a few weeks ago, comparing both approaches, like the more, well, I could say traditional map, like Cartesian map, Euclidean map that you see on the left, and the more sensibility mapping approach. So they will be available at some points. And she is also trying to work on a bigger publication for her work. She's been doing a lot of work on sensibility mapping with different types of women, including in Morocco, for instance. So I'm going back.
There was an interesting comment by Lorraine. Do you want to?
Go ahead, Leah, if you want to.
Lorraine, do you want me to read it, or do you want to say it yourself?
Well, I guess that I could say it. I mean, it just seems like, hi Leah. It just seems like such just trying to go through the exercise of reading this transcript, I kept coming up against the kind of like wall of all of the methodological challenges that you guys sort of alluded to at the beginning of your presentation. And one that seemed really important to me was just that some locations seem so important and have such emotional weight, whereas others perhaps, might just be passing reference to different locations. And the map the Cartesian map, at least as represented here, has this kind of flattening effect in the emotional realm, but Elise's maps just look like a really interesting way of representing the different emotional weight of the stories.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And big part of when we do this is determining like what's an accessory place or what's just a mention, and what defines like a setting, or or is really important in the context of the story.
But in thinking of how to represent, like how to give weight on the map to different places, there is a way to do that on Atlascine, because you can choose the length of the tag. So if you choose a small tag, it'll be a small ring. But if I hope I'm not wrong in saying this, but you can choose more lines, and therefore it gives you more rings. And so the place seems more weighted than associated with the color. So that's one way you could get around that.
Maybe to add a bit on that is that we've been trying to map emotion. That was kind of the original idea of the project. We just gave it up with this kind of mapping. So this is where Elise's kind of work is so important, because with our approach, you're freed from the Euclidean structure, which is very constraining, right? You need to have a point that is located. But you also freed on some kind of having a common way of reading the story, like a framework that is consistent enough to be able to be replicable through different stories. And each story obviously is very different, but if you want to compare somehow them, you need to have some kind of common framework. But when you think about emotion, some of the people in those stories, they will express their emotion. Also, usually people from Rwanda, they try to not to express them too much. Furthermore, people who went through these extreme moments. But so sometimes you can read between the line that there is an emotion, but like, what is the real emotion? What is the thing that is not said? Like so we can, and this is something that Stephen has been talking about, like mapping the silence, just the silence. It would be possible. It would be easily possible just to identify the silence. And so we identify the silence, and they don't need to be associated to a place. We could just do it with the text and then try to look at where the silence are and then try to understand what they mean. But that requires a high level of interpretation. And this is where you can do it on moments, on specific story, and that's what Elise do. But if the idea is to try to have those stories enter into conversation like more stories, then it becomes difficult. This is where this kind of application can be useful for that purpose. But of course, again, you're losing that for sure. A comment from Rebecca about Emmanuel. I don't know if you added that emoji. So there's surviving Nyamata also. Yeah. So is the term survived is used by her? I don't remember.
It is.
It is.
In the English translation, it is. She's referencing something her sister said, and her sister said, you survived. You came from Naimata. You really had to face it. You lived through it. And then later on, she said, survived. Oh, this happiness to have survived.
Yeah. And that's also like a conversation that's going on among the member of that community, is like defining who is a survivor, and clearly she was just, her sister was associated her with surviving, going back to the atrocity of Nyamata.
Diana, you wanted to go?
I just wanted to add that for her, the village where, or the place where her family was from, I guess you could also include tags like genocide and violence, because that's what the story is referring to as well.
Yes.
So sorry, where should we tag that?
In Yamata, where her parents were, right?
Yes.
Okay. And maybe to so the way we've been doing it, just to give a bit of background. So we started with this story. We started with our own categories, whatever. Then we showed the result with members of the community. We had several events, and they told us what they thought. There were some missing categories, for instance. They told us that they wanted to see what happened in 1994 when people left, the religious issues. So we had all different interaction with the people. So we revisited the categories, and so the definition of the category, and then to be consistent, you need to have some criteria. So we spent quite a bit of time, several years actually, just to think about what are the topics that not only could be of interest, of course they have to be of interest, but also could be manageable in the context of a project like that. And of course it creates some constraint, but that the application here has been designed to enable changes, adding, removing, recreating. And it's also, it's an open source platform, so it could be used by different people for different projects. So for instance, if any people here have one story or more that they're interested in mapping, we're more than welcome. They will be more than welcome to let us know, and we could definitely help you up to set up your own mapping project, because we've been doing that for other project.
I wanted to ask a question to the group, because I know we selected this story segment in the context of this broader conference that's about gender, right? And I was wondering if anyone had some associations, seen some associations to gender in this text. And if so, how and where?
Well, I think there's a pretty strong connection in terms of the story between two sisters, and also the caregiving role that, I'm sorry, now I've lost my screen with the names, but Emmanuel's sister takes on even in such difficult conditions. So that's a gendered role. And also the theme of her pregnancy. I mean, not much is said about that, but the fact that she managed to still be 5 months pregnant and proceeding with her pregnancy under such adverse conditions, to me, that's also a gendered story.
Patricia?
Hi, I just added connections between women when they support each other in the very basic tasks at home, or maybe roles are usually the eldest taking care of the youngest, but now is the youngest taking care of the eldest sister. So this relationship of sisterhood and about doing things in the house that are practical, like a survival, like this motherly figure that between women, one is becoming the mother. So I think these are gendered issues, and also, yeah, the sense of community that the gender aspect brings. Because this sister was taking care of all the people in the household, even they are not family, but she creates this community.
Marcela raised her hand. Yeah, but Rebecca just put it in the chat. I was gonna say the same. I find it interesting how they describe it as someone's wife, someone's daughter, like it's in relation to someone as well. That's it.
Okay, well, meanwhile, Emory is adding some tags and then developing the map here. But yeah, like the Emmanuel sisters in this segment is really described as taking care of pretty much the entire not only family but beyond their sister and everyone. Is there any other things that you would like to discuss here? Because we're pretty much done. So I know we have an hour and a half, but we may not need to take all that time if you don't.
There is a question, Rebecca.
Okay.
And Cynthia after.
Yeah, I found it interesting that the interviewer is the one who brought up the fact that the sister was the younger sister, and I'm questioning whether Emmanuel thought of her in that context of who's supposed to be the protector, or if because the interviewer brought the age up that became a topic in the discussion. That relevance of age and who's supposed to protect or take care of whom.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, that's the beauty of having the entire story, I'd say, because we only mapped one segment, but usually the interviews follow the same patterns where you start with the childhood and then all the way through the exile, genocide, and post-genocide. So you are able to answer some of these questions by knowing what came before.
Cynthia, you have a question?
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing I wanted to say is just what an incredible tool this is. You know, I'm so interested in spatializing memories. I haven't done any work on the Rwandan genocide, but it just seems to me so valuable given the kinds of issues we've talked about already, how difficult it is to remember the specifics of place and location, as well as many other things when you're in traumatic conditions, you know, to have a kind of, and genocide obliterates memories, as we know, it obliterates collective understandings of a given people. So being able to locate, even imperfectly, these stories, this particular group of stories, I think is phenomenal. And I also really love this tool because so okay, yes, it's Euclidean space, but the interface is such that it's very legible. So everybody today is used to using, you know, interactive maps that zoom in and out, so people will get it. And also people are used to video format. So the two things that you encounter right off the bat are very familiar to people. And so there's an ease of entry, but then it very quickly becomes nuanced. So you can make all these selections in terms of where you want to learn about, what aspects of the interviewee's stories you want to hear about in more detail. And I think it also looks beautiful, even though what it's representing is terrible stuff. It also, just as a design, I think it's kind of incredible. So it's fascinating to hear about how challenging it is and to see for ourselves through your example, our case study today, how hard it is to map the emotions. But nevertheless, I think it's fantastic. So kudos to all of you. So anyway, all that's kind of leading to a question. One of the things I'm finding with a research project of my own right now is that that people don't necessarily speak about their life experiences in spatial terms. And like the shoe is just dropping very slowly for me in that regard, because I realize that I have always thought about my life in spatial terms, and I've been drawn to work with collaborators who do the same. But in the interviews that I've been doing over the past year, it's kind of challenging to get people to talk about their memories as place-based, or as even geolocated, or even as having to do with a room, you know, in their home or something like that. It's definitely a kind of a real massaging of the interview to get to the spatial aspects of people's stories. And so I know that these interviews were done a long time ago, and the focus on space wasn't as important as the stories of survival. But since you have worked with so many of them, this interviews in this collection, I'm curious as to the team's own sense of how spatial the memories are as a whole, beyond this example.
Emery, you're muted.
I can respond to that. There are huge differences. Some people, I mean, in fact, this story by Emmanuel is very spatial. However, when we showed her the map of her story, it kind of struck her in an odd way, like she never saw her story strictly in such spatial terms. And for her, the locations she revealed in her life story weren't sent, or like she didn't really intend to, or they weren't really important to what she was saying, actually. And that's what she told us. And that was interesting. I mean, other people would almost never mention places, and they would mention maybe one or two clues throughout the entire story, and it would require a lot of interpretation and a lot of sort of amorphous mapping. And then other people were super consistent, almost almost academic in their like listing of where they went and places they traveled, and all of that had to do with the diversity of stories we were dealing with. I mean, they were all from the same project at Codes, but some of them had different interviewers. Some of the interviewers were actually, we know, were more interested in spatial things. And so, yeah, it's a whole other realm, like exploring the different ways in which memories are revealed spatially or not. A lot of it has to do with the environment they're in and who they're talking to and where that person is from. That was a big factor. Revealing more about Rwanda because the person they're talking to knows Rwanda. I mean, and the same thing for Montreal and so on. So there's a lot of factors there to take into account. But yeah, it's a super interesting topic.
If I can add to what your comment, Emery, is that like one function that we plan to add is to have like the timeline being like a graph with the intensity of the topic throughout the story. So you would read visually not spatial anymore, but temporally the intensity of the theme. So they don't need to be geo-tagged, because you can just put a theme and no place, and you can still see the color appear in the map, and then you can see how it's spread out through so the map becomes one of the 4 elements then that are there: the map, the timeline, the video, and the transcript. Because I think it is important there are many things that are not geolocated here that are important, and I think we still need to be able to enable people to visualize them, even if they're not spatial. So for instance, just like memories, some are not spatial, but they may be related to the same type of event. So if you caught an event with a certain color, you can see in which moment in the story it's associated. So you can go back there, or you can see if there's any trends or whatever. You can do whatever you want. So that's what we're working on. One thing that I also want to mention that's been important for Emmanuel Kayungawa, at least the way she told us, and many other people we've been showing those, is that it seems like a good option to reach a different audience. We want our stories to be heard. We want to be able to reach kids. we want then to be able to listen to our stories. If our story stays on a server somewhere that you have to listen from the beginning to the end, the likelihood of having access to the story is not that high. So they're really like the support that we get from the community. I mean, they're always critic, but they're very bienveillant is the term that I would use, and this is also something that is quite because every time we show those maps to the community, we're always worried that for whatever reason it's not gonna do what they think it should do, and every time they come back very positively with some comments, but also really say that a broader audience could have access to those stories, and this is what matters at this stage. And so having that tool, this is great, because then it's another way of making those stories available.
Sebastian, I don't know if it's a good idea, but I would suggest that if we have time and if there's no other questions, we can look at this map. We can listen to the story again and look at the map that we co-created today together to see how the themes are emerging of this segment of the story, if people want to look at it again.
We can do that for sure. Is there any other, thank you, Recipe, for this suggestion. Is there any other question before we do that?
I actually have another question. I don't want to dominate this though. So if there's somebody else, they should go first.
Go ahead, Cynthia.
Okay. So I'm wondering if I can draw upon your collective expertise as geographers, cartographers, people interested in space. Would you have any advice for those of us who are doing interviews about what kinds of questions we can ask that would encourage spatial answers? This is a very self-interested question, but I'd be very curious to hear what you'd have to say. I mean, beyond like where did that happen, and was there a special place, or like can you think of anything that you would love for oral historians to be asking, with a view to more of these kinds of tools, more maps like this being developed?
Yeah, I think it depends the kind of questions that you have and the kind of structure of interview that you want to achieve. Like you can have like a really open life story approach. So people start talking and you try to listen without interfere in their narrative. And when you have that, you need to let the storyteller talk. But there are some points that they will that you have a sense that they are trying to say something maybe about a place, because I believe like stories always have that. So then you can without really direct the life story, you can just say like, hey, could you talk me about that experience? Could you talk me about maybe that place? I'm pretty sure that it will come. Like we need to listen. That the other approach that people have, in fact, in my own work, is that there are like semi-structured questions. So of course, in my work, it's about migration, post-mortem migration, exile. So you have already some set of questions that will lead you to that. So already have like, could you talk me about the repatriation of the body? And of course, space will come. I really like, I'm always driving towards the life stories, because I like the people who talk about that. And then you have the transcript and then you go in depth. But I believe like it's how you imagine this. And if you are really, my advice is that if you're really concerned about that, maybe it's having a set of questions in a really semi-open interview that will lead you to that, because you already have memories related to what place. So maybe you can just lead the interview towards that. I don't know if somebody else has a.
Yeah, I wanted to add maybe that, I mean, there's always this tension, right? Because you don't want to elicit too much, because or else you just get what you ask for, and you already know what you ask for. You want what you don't know, right? So it's always this thing of like, how do I, so I think that, I mean, Jose's obviously a good option. Sometimes what I use is having a map present in the interview, but of course it can't be like I mean, it could be a globe, but it works better when it's like a smaller space. And you don't necessarily have to point people to the map, but usually if there is a map, it could encourage them to use it, and to like, it could help probe some memories as well. Yeah, just to build on that, because I had the same experience, the same idea as you, Leah, about the Google Maps. But I had in 2018, we made an interview with our Ghost Bikes project, and we had a paper map, and then the storytellers navigate like quickly to the Google map, like they want to see that. So for me, it was really interesting that they want a really digital map, so can zoom in, zoom out the streets, the places. So I believe like we need to have they need to have the choice to choose which map they should use.
Yeah, and the digital map solves a lot of issues with that.
Indeed.
The issues of scale.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll put a map in front of people and there's just they're not receptive to it at all. So yeah, then that option just doesn't work. So it doesn't always work.
If you get us going with maps, Cynthia, it's not. I'm not sure it's a good idea. But just to add on that, the Google Map is also, it's been also described as a way to ostracize, or at least to try to trace where people have been moving from place A, place B by institution and by border patrol police. So they've been using those maps to task where they were the day before, to try to find inconsistencies in the stories and to try to find ways to kick out people from countries. So in some instances, it's been avoided by people who really want to tell their story, and that have also tried to escape those kinds of environment. So there is a balance here, right? It depends on the context. Maybe two other things very quickly I want to say. For me, what's interesting in those stories is that the places are somehow buried there, and we need to make an effort to find them. If we didn't have to do that, then we would not be where we are now. So I'm not necessarily looking for things where it's easy, where it happens here, it happens here, it happens here, because there's many other applications that do that very well. So what is interesting with this one is just like, you need to make the effort to go to listen, to spend time to try to identify those things, those places, and then to always keep the link. So I'm not necessarily rooting for having more easily stories that are more easily mappable, because I know how to do that. Where we know how to do that. Where it's more complex is those stories. And that's where it's more interesting from a chronological perspective. And finally, the last thing I want to say is that depending on the interviewer, so we had different interview and we did some kind of an analysis. And so the interview, there's one geographer who did part of the interview where he was doing his master, Jonathan Wu, and he was interested in places. And so we saw that there's a trend for if the interviewer is more interested in places, that people will be more specific in terms of places. So we identify that. But if the person is not interested in places, if there's no places asking the question, it doesn't mean that the answer will not be related to places. So basically, the interviewer can orient toward more specific places. Okay, tell me what happened in this particular village, or can you really go deeper into this particular place? But if the interviewer is not interested, which was the case of most of them, it really depends on the interviewee, who will decide to go into details or will decide to not go into. But it doesn't work the way around.
I also have a point to add in regarding to this interviewer interview. I think as an interviewer, having a minimum knowledge of the person and the context that you are asking question will be really helpful in discovering different dimensions of a story in more depth. So I think it will be really interesting to know the context, what will be the possible aspects that they're going to share with you, and the research before about the locations, geographies, and aspects that you think might be interested for the interview, and then go to the interview. And then I think in that sense, you will have a deeper engagement in terms of the conversation and the specialities that they might share with you.
Thank you all so much. Those were great answers.
Okay. it's 10:50, and I know we have until 10:30, but I would rather let people decide if they want to listen to, because the map is online, right? Everything that's been done by Emory is online. So maybe Emory, you can put the link and show how to have access to it, and people could listen to it and see that if they want to. Again, you'll need a good internet connection, and fortunately, that's the limit at the moment. But if anyone is interested in mapping the stories, please be in touch. Cynthia, if you're interested, we're super open to mapping any kind of story. We'll set it up with you. And as you can see, it requires a bit of work for tagging, and that we cannot do that, right? I mean, we can train people. It's not complicated when you understand how it works. It's pretty easy, but still, it's not something that you do in half an hour. But if you want to start with one story, and we can really help you out and show you what's possible, and then we can discuss it. Before we close here, I also want to thank everyone again for your presence. Thank you, Jose, Leah, Sepide, Emory. Thank you, Cynthia, for the invitation, and for space for running the workshop, but also all the people behind the scene who are developing this tool, because there's a lot of people that are not here. Page Ronda for providing all the content from this atlas. So thank you very much to Page Ronda and to the people involved in that community, and also the people at Carleton University who are doing the coding of the application. So the people at the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center, they're the one like doing the code. So we have the vision, but they really help us refining the vision, tell us what's possible. So it's an open source platform, everything, all the code is possible and accessible. And finally, the funders, because it's funded by SSHRC, it's funded by FR3SC, and it's been funded over the last few years by Canary Canada. And so we're very grateful for this financial support as well. So thank you, everyone, and be in touch if you have any question.
Thank you so much to the Geomedia Lab for sharing this amazing tool with all of us today. That was absolutely fantastic, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. Anyway, bravo. Thank you, everybody. Please join me in thanking Sebastian and all the students. It was great. I don't know, Anna, should I hand it over to you here?
Well, I think thanks, Cynthia, and thanks, Sebastian, for the shout out. We appreciate it. Yeah, we're in the transitional space right now in between this workshop and the next. So we'll keep things running here. If you all want to keep chatting in a casual way, we can stop the Facebook live streams so that you can, and we can stop the recording as well, so that you can feel like you're in a kind of safe space, and we'll get folks set up for the next workshop as they trickle in. But I encourage you to continue the conversation here if you're willing and able to do so. We do also still have our breakout rooms activated from the last 2 days. So if you'd like to hop into the discussion lounge with a buddy that you see here, that you'd like to kind of have a more private conversation, you're welcome to do that. And then the Research Creation Media Room has a few featured projects